the Mythos of Ambrose Bierce. Stories that Ambrose Bierce linked together into a sort of universe of horror. It's popular to say these days that Bierce is one of the sources for H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and that's true. Bierce wrote several stories that contained names that were reused, usually in a very different way, by Robert W. Chambers, a contemporary of his. Chambers rolled those into his own little mythos, his own connected series of horror stories. And then Lovecraft folded the Chambers world into his own stories, and he too was aware of Bierce and was conscious of what he was doing. So Bierce is part of the Lovecraft mythos, but what I wanted to point out is not that. It's that Bierce kind of had his own set of connected stories, and they're not exactly the same as the ones that fans of Lovecraft are familiar with. Now, the two that provide most of those place names and proper names, character names in Lovecraft and in Chambers are Haita the Shepherd, which is a sort of allegorical, fable-like story, and an inhabitant of Carcosa, which is more of a straightforward horror story. And let me start with Haita because I want to dismiss it from the Bierce mythos. I don't think it really fits. It seems to be grouped with it if you come to it from Lovecraft or from Chambers, because Lovecraft and Chambers used words from it and folded them into their own creative work. But if you look at what Bierce was actually doing with it, Haita is really not connected with the linked set of horror stories that I want to talk about. But an inhabitant of Carcosa really is. And I want to argue that it's linked to two other Bierce stories, and they form kind of a coherent set of horrific premises that go together. The other two stories, as I consult my notes here, are The Death of Halpin Frayser and The Moonlit Road. And I'll kind of show you where Bierce got his ideas and what he did with them, because I think they're amazing. I think these stories, especially The Death of Halpin Frayser, are some of the very best that you could ever read. Definitely on a par with, and I'm going to, for my own personal sake, say that they're better than anything Lovecraft wrote. All right, what's going on in these stories? The first of these to appear in print was An Inhabitant of Carcosa. And, sorry for my papers, they're all over the place. An Inhabitant of Carcosa came out in 1886, and it's an eerie and very moody piece, very much about the description of the landscape and the mood that the narrator finds himself in. He finds himself wandering in a strange landscape, and ultimately he makes a disturbing discovery about what has happened to him and what has happened to the city that he lived in and the entire civilization that he lived in. Well, The Inhabitant of Carcosa starts with a quote from Hali, the poet Hali, and I'm going to read you a little bit of that quote. Now, when I say the poet Hali, there are real people with that name, and in Bierce's lifetime there was an Urdu poet who was a close contemporary of Bierce, and I don't read Urdu, but from what I've investigated, I don't think that this particular Hali could have been the one that Bierce is talking about. I think that this little epigraph that Bierce draws from Hali is his own invention. There are other kind of more likely candidates to be the Hali in his story, including a 10th century astronomer, but I think he made it all up, and it very much sets up the premise of his story. Okay, so here's a little bit of this epigraph that begins An Inhabitant of Carcosa. It talks about death and how sometimes when people die, not only does their soul vanish, but their body with it. And then he talks about the more relevant one to the story he's about to tell. He says, "In one kind of death the spirit also dieth, and this it hath been known to do, while yet the body was in vigor for many years." Okay, so kind of like a zombie. That's not this story. That's the Death of Halpin Frayser. But we'll get to that in a minute. But sometimes, as is veritably attested, it dieth with the body, the soul does, and after a season is raised up again in that place where the body did decay. Okay, so sometimes the soul dies with the body, and then the soul comes back later on its own, and that's what happens in an Inhabitant of Carcosa. Okay, so there's Hali, and when it comes to Halpin Frayser, Bierce again uses an epigraph from Hali, who I'm still going to claim is his own invention, even though there are real people with that name. And here's what he says in the beginning of the Death of Halpin Frayser. For by death is wrought greater change than hath been shown, whereas in general the spirit that removed cometh back upon occasion, and is sometimes seen of those in flesh, appearing in the form of the body it bore, so ghosts, right? Yet it hath happened that the veritable body without the spirit hath walked, so more like a zombie. And it is attested of those encountering who have lived to speak thereon, that a lich, that's a corpse, so raised up, hath no natural affection, not remembrance thereof, but only hate. And it is also known that some spirits, which in life were benign, become by death evil altogether. So that's the premise of the Death of Halpin Frayser. The body comes back, and not only is it hostile and dangerous, but it's dangerous to people that it once loved. And this is just a really familiar idea from modern zombie movies and so forth, but not so familiar in Bierce's time. And I think he just made it up there. I think that he made it up for his use in these several stories. So one theory that, or one little fictional expert that's giving you quotes about both ghosts and zombies and how they work. Okay, so back to an Inhabitant of Carcosa. At the end of it, it turns out that it's set in a time long after the character lived, that he is viewing things from beyond death. Sorry for the spoiler. But how can he tell us this? Well, it turns out that it's being narrated by a spirit medium, by a spiritualist. And it says, so the whole story has happened at this point. The very last thing it says is, such are the facts imparted to the medium Beirolus by the spirit of this character that was speaking the whole time. Okay, so who is the medium Beirolus? We've never heard of him anywhere else. This is the first time he appears anywhere in fiction that I know of. And so he is a spirit medium. Okay, well, this spirit medium comes up one more time in Bierce stories, and that's in the Moonlit Road. The Moonlit Road happens in 3 parts. The first part is told by a normal guy who's the son of this couple that had a tragic ending. The second part is told by his father, who is a murderer and also has gone mad from what he did. But it's still normal narration like you'd see in any sort of fiction. And then the third part is narrated by the first guy's mother, by the murder victim of the father. And she's speaking to us. How can this be? Well, it can be because of this medium Beirolus. This same seance guy has channeled her voice and is telling her part of the story. So there's a repeated gimmick, and between those 2 repeated gimmicks, this medium guy and this supposed expert Hali, we can link together those 3 stories into one little mythos. Okay, well, where in the world did Bierce get these ideas? Sometimes that's fun to speculate about with fiction writers, but in Bierce's case, he spelled it all out. And that's what I want to turn to next, as I grab my disorganized papers. He spelled it out in an essay called Visions of the Night. This is a terrific piece of reading for anybody that likes horror stories. And it doesn't start off sounding like it's going to be really interesting, but it gets there. He says in the beginning, I hold the belief that the gift of dreams is a valuable literary endowment. That if by some art not now understood, the elusive fancies that it supplies could be caught and fixed and made to serve, we should have a literature exceeding fair. So what he's saying there is dreams are great material, but it's super hard to turn them into good writing, and almost nobody does it. And this is true. If you want to try writing fiction yourself, if you've already tried it, it's really hard to not make the dream more meaningful than dreams really are, to make them seem kind of heavy-handedly symbolic. At least that's my experience. And I think you don't see that many really well-rendered dreams in fiction, unless they're really brief and they're just, the guy wakes up out of a, dream of this and that, and it's over in a sentence or two. Bierce himself mentions the example of Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which Coleridge always claims was an opium dream that he was having. So he acknowledges there are some successful pieces written upon dreams, but he says basically it's kind of hard to do that, and that's too bad because there's lots of great material there. Now he's publishing this about a year after An Inhabitant of Carcosa, so I think he is. I don't know for sure that he wrote the things in the order that he published them, but I think he probably did. And I think he's already tried An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and even though it's a cool story, I suspect that he's not satisfied that he's captured the feelings that were really in the dream. And I think that's his reason for writing this essay. So he goes on to speculate about dreams. He talks about memory and imagination. He makes some observations such as, why don't you smell things in dreams when you can see and hear them? And I'm not even sure that's true, but he says it is. So he says a few things like that. And this is all fine, intellectually interesting. But then he gets to the horror stuff, which is what's more interesting to me. And he's going to recount 3 dreams for us. One of them is about a talking horse, and he himself admits that just seems silly. And it was so silly that he then gave it to a friend of his, another writer, Flora MacDonald Shearer, and she wrote a very lengthy poem on the theme. I'm reading it. I'll get back to you maybe about whether I like it. It's no Bierce, I'll say that. And the other 2 dreams that he recounts in this essay are very similar to the Death of Halpin Frayser and to the Inhabitant of Carcosa. Okay, so Halpin Frayser, I'll start with that one. And he recounts it at length. This is kind of a good short story in its own right, but I'm going to give you just a little flavor of it instead of reading the whole thing. I was walking at dusk through a great forest of unfamiliar trees. Whence and whither I did not know. I had a sense of the vast extent of the wood, a consciousness that I was the only living thing in it. I was obsessed by some awful spell in expiation of a forgotten crime committed, as I vaguely surmised, against the sunrise. Mechanically and without hope, I moved under the arms of the giant trees, along a narrow trail penetrating the haunted solitudes of the forest. I came at length to a brook that flowed darkly and sluggishly across my path, and saw that it was blood. Turning to the right, I followed it up a considerable distance, and soon came to a small circular opening in the forest, filled with the dim, unreal light, by which I saw in the center of the opening a deep tank of white marble. It was filled with blood, and the stream that I had followed up was its outlet. All round the tank, between it and the enclosing forest, a space of perhaps 10 feet in breadth, paved with immense slabs of marble, were dead bodies of men, a score. Though I did not count them, I knew that the number had some significant and portentous relation to my crime. So this dream of guilt and horrible bloodshed in a forest, this is the basis of the Death of Halpin Frayser. And Bierce recounts it very powerfully here, but not as powerfully as he later will in Halpin Frayser itself. So, what's happening here? He recognizes dreams as a great source of material for fiction. He's already tried to turn a nightmare into fiction at least once, maybe wasn't satisfied with it, and kind of came back to the topic here, as I'll show in a moment, and was also sort of recording some other nightmares that he thought could be used in fiction. Okay, now this other dream that I would argue is the source of An Inhabitant of Carcosa. Here's a little flavor of it, and it's similar in mood. I was alone on a boundless level in the night. In my bad dreams I am always alone, and is usually night. No trees were anywhere in sight, no habitations of men, no streams nor hills. The earth seemed to be covered with a short, coarse vegetation that was black and stubby, as if the plain had been swept by fire. My way was broken here and there as I went forward, with I know not what purpose, by small pools of water occupying shallow depressions, as if the fire had been succeeded by rain. These pools were on every side, and kept vanishing and appearing. Kept vanishing and appearing again, as heavy dark clouds drove athwart those parts of the sky which they reflected. And it goes on in this mood, and this is not the same as the opening of An Inhabitant of Carcosa, but they have this in common, that they sort of paint this very poetic picture of a bleak landscape that goes on for quite a while. Okay, he goes into a house, and this house that he has found has towers that shut out the stars directly overhead. He passes in at an open portal between columns of cyclopean masonry, whose single stones were larger than my father's house. And if you're a Lovecraft fan, that probably tripped some recognition, because Lovecraft loved these settings where it was buildings that were on some vastly superhuman scale, and that's how you knew that it was alien. That's how you knew that you didn't belong there, was that it was just too big. And so here's a hint of that in Bierce, including that exact word that Lovecraft loved so much, cyclopean. Okay, he goes on. The guy goes into the house. Everything was coated with the dust of desertion. And he's looking around. There's descriptions of his footfalls and the dust and the echoes and all this. There's a crimson light outdoors from the setting sun. Skip a lot here. He finally comes to a room of ordinary size. I discovered in the farthest angle of this huge house, the outline, or of this room of ordinary size within this huge house, the outlines of a bed, and approached it with the prescience of ill. I felt that here somehow the bad business of my adventure was to end with some horrible climax, yet could not resist the spell that urged me to the fulfillment. Upon the bed, partly clothed, lay the dead body of a human being. It lay upon its back, the arms straight along the sides. By bending over it, which I did with loathing but no fear, I could see that it was dreadfully decomposed. The ribs protruded from the leathern flesh. Through the skin of the sunken belly could be seen the protuberances of the spine. The face was black and shriveled, and the lips, drawn away from the yellow teeth, cursed it with a ghastly grin. A fullness under the closed lids seemed to indicate that the eyes had survived the general wreck, and this was true, for as I bent above them, they slowly opened and gazed into mine with a tranquil, steady regard. Imagine my horror how you can. No words of mine can assist the conception. The eyes were my own. Okay, so this is very similar to the ending of Carcosa. In Carcosa, the guy finds his own tombstone that's been weathered for centuries, so he realizes he's somewhere far in his own future. But this is much more visceral. Here, it's not his tombstone, it's his own corpse that looks him in the eye. So, to me, this is an improvement. He's sort of rewritten Carcosa here, and it's even better this way. Okay. Well, so he goes on to the Death of Halpin Frayser, and I grab my notes here. The So the next thing that he writes in this little sequence, there are other stories and journalism and so forth between, but the next thing that he writes in this little grouping after Visions of the Night, the essay we just looked at, is The Death of Halpin Frayser in about 1891. It does, as I said, have an epigraph by Hali to link it to Carcosa, or maybe just to reuse that concept in what he feels like is a better way. That story has, again, this feeling of forgotten crime, and it's strongly hinted in the story that one of the crimes is incest, and there are also mysterious murders of loved ones in this story. Some of the imagery is the same, the forest drenched in blood, and so forth. In The Death of Halpin Frayser, one of the amazing things about it is its structure. It's in sections like a lot of Bierce's story, and they sort of fit together in a puzzle-like way, where you can put them together and you can eventually understand everything that happened to the characters in this horrible string of murders and zombie action and ghostly voices and everything else. But it takes a little effort, and it's very different than I think a lot of modern stories where once you click it together you have a satisfying resolution, and it, to me, kind of undoes any horror that you were feeling. In Bierce, the more you understand, the worse it seems, the more terrifying it seems. One other thing about The Death of Halpin Frayser, it has a couple of police officers investigating crimes that seem like normal human crimes and then get deeper and more supernatural as they go. And this is the part that Robert W. Chambers lifted wholesale into his own stories, like Maker of Moons. But it also has very much the feel and premise of Twin Peaks, and I've always wondered if somebody involved with Twin Peaks had read the Bierce or the Chambers and maybe thought what a great idea that was. Okay, now we want to talk a little bit about Begorolus the Medium. Um, he's the character who links both Inhabitant of Carcosa and the Moonlit Road, and this brings me to the Moonlit Road. This story has a very important place in history, even though it's not that famous in its own right, because it was sort of used by people like a Japanese writer named Akutagawa. Afterworld, the ghosts don't know everything, and they're not comforted by being reunited with dead loved ones. They only hope for contact with the living, and they can only see them in very limited circumstances. They can't see in the sunlight or even exist in the sunlight. And only once in a great while can the people that they loved see them. And in this story, that turns out very badly for everyone. So, The Moonlit Road, a great story, and even though I like Halpin Frayser even better. Okay, so we talked about the sources that Bierce used to get this kind of material. It was dreams, and he was, from an early stage, consciously trying to tell dreams and figure out how to tell them in a convincing way, even though he realized that it was very rare that that worked out well. And so part of what he discovered to make this work was multiple points of view and this kind of fragmentary approach. And this is what I think contributes to the greatness of his work, is that he discovered technical innovations and then he applied them to deep psychology, to specific psychological problems that he already knew existed in fiction that other people weren't solving. I think there's one other source for this mythos of connected horror stories, and that's Edgar Allan Poe, particularly this sort of prose poem or story called Silence, a Fable, which we have a recording of here on this channel. And I say this for a couple of reasons. In Inhabitant of Carcosa, the character at one point is approached by a lynx. Why a lynx of all things? Well, it ends up having something to do with the setting, but also because this is something that Poe used in Silence, where he has a very cryptic image of at the end of a lynx staring the narrator in the face. And the other thing is the rhythm. In Silence, Poe developed this incantatory rhythm that has almost no peer in English. And I think that Bierce tried several times in his life to duplicate that rhythm. One time was in his most famous story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where he gets something of the dream state of that poem through powerful rhythm. And probably his most successful use of that Poe rhythm from Silence is in The Death of Halpin Frayser. If you read the scene where our narrator goes wandering in a bloody woods, it sounds a lot like Poe. And then there's a character, a dead American poet, Myron Bayne, brought in. He's not much like Poe, but I think that might be Bierce's little tip of the hat to Edgar Allan Poe, his main influence in horror.